Last summer, federal and state agents arrested over a dozen men accused of participating in a criminal conspiracy to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Turns out, several of the men participating in the plot were wired informants. The DOJ viewed the case as an example of how various law enforcement entities could work together to stop violent extremists, while others see it as simply a setup.
Wow, imagine that from the FBI. According to a new BuzzFeed report, quote, informants acting under the direction of the FBI played a far larger role than previously reported. Working in secret, they did more than just passively observe. They had a hand in nearly every aspect of the alleged plot, starting with its inception. The extent of their involvement raises questions as to whether there would have been a conspiracy without them.
Here to weigh in on this is Intercept reporter Trevor Aaronson, who has perhaps done more reporting on these kind of entrapment schemes cooked up by the FBI than any other reporter over the past decade. Trevor, welcome to Rising.
Thanks for having me.
So when you first heard of this arrest last summer, what was your initial reaction as somebody who's covered so many of these types of arrests, though not with kind of domestic white nationalist organizations? Your coverage has mostly been with Islamic extremists.
Yeah, I mean, so my initial reaction was that this was, very similar to the type of sting operations we've seen the FBI run against Islamist extremists since 9/11. And this isn't the first time we've seen the FBI run these types of operations against right-wing extremists. They are not nearly as common as those targeting Islamist extremists. Since 9/11, more than 350 people have been charged in international terrorism sting operations involving plots, seemingly connected to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others. The plots affecting, right-wing extremists are far, far fewer, but there have been ones before this case. For example, there was a man in Utah named William Keebler who had been at the Bundy standoff in Nevada and got involved in a plot to bomb a Bureau of Land Management office as a result of an FBI sting. And, this case seemed to be very similar, where they were taking people whose ideology was, unpopular or extreme, and provided them with the means and opportunity to get involved in a plot and then charge them accordingly. What's unique, I think, about this case in BuzzFeed's most recent reporting is the scale of the informant involvement. In this particular case, according to BuzzFeed, there were 12 informants involved. In reviewing hundreds of these types of cases, I've never seen that many informants. I mean, it's not uncommon to have 2 or 3 agents or informants and involved in a plot and involved in kind of groups and organizing the plot. But to have that scale is really unprecedented. And
that's the part that I want to key in on with you, Trevor. It's amazing because if you go back to the way the media treated the initial reports of this uncritically, they talked about it so much. And then as the writing was sort of appearing on the wall, whereas people like you were probably able to see right away, there might have been more to the story. I think at the Federalist we published something on this potentially being an entrapment scheme back in October, and I believe we have a graphic of that. But the broader point here is, do you think, based on the information coming out, that BuzzFeed report did shed a whole lot of light on the story, would this have happened without the FBI informants being involved? Because what we see is them paying for travel. We see them pushing people to act, saying, what are we actually going to do about this?
And proposing the idea in the first place.
They're sort of talking about it, and there's these Facebook chats. They're talking about it in their group chats. And you have the FBI informants being like, well, should we do something about this? What are we actually going to do about this? So from your read of the situation right now, Trevor, do you think that this would have unfolded in the way it did were it not for those informants?
I mean, most likely not, given the large number of informants involved and their place within the conspiracy. I mean, including one being in second command of the entire organization, as it were. And so, to me, this strikes me as very similar to the type of sting operations we've seen targeting Islamist extremists, where the people involved either don't have the capacity on their own, or don't even have the idea on their own, and it's the FBI undercover agent or informant who is providing either the idea and or all of the means necessary to commit this crime. It's worth noting, I think, that the record of conviction in these types of cases is overwhelming in the government's favor. I mean, the conviction rate in federal court is north of 90%. In general, involving these kinds of sting operations, it's even higher. And so juries have not been willing, at least in the cases so far that have gone to trial, to push back on the government and view these cases as entrapment or government mishandling in some way or malfeasance in some way. I think what will be interesting in this case is whether a jury will be more open to arguments of entrapment, given that this is a group of white defendants compared to the largely Muslim and black defendants we've seen in terrorism stings, and whether there'll be any difference because of the ideology, because, in previous cases we've seen mostly Islamist ideology. In this case, it's kind of right-wing extremism. But absolutely, I think the same criticism and questions that exist in the hundreds of cases that I've reviewed in the post 9/11 era certainly apply to this. And I absolutely agree with you about the media's initial reaction. This came at a time when, just before the election, when I think there was concerns that Trump was inspiring violence. And I think, this easily fit into a narrative that the media was willing to buy into at the time. And so I think it's good that, these questions are coming out now, perhaps a little late. But in many ways, we saw this mirrored 15 years ago when the FBI was pursuing Islamist extremists, and we saw, the media take quite a long time to kind of figure out that these cases aren't all that they appear to be.
And of the 350 plus cases that you've looked at, over the years, how just a ballpark, how many of those do you think would have come off without FBI involvement? In other words, how often does the FBI actually discover an organic plot and foil it, compared to the FBI coming up with the plot and then arresting the people that they tricked into participating in it?
Yeah, so a hard number is difficult to say, given that all of these cases are very different, and the circumstances are very different. The capacity of the defendants is very different. But that said, there has never been an FBI sting operation like this where the FBI, arrests someone and says, look, here he was with a bomb of his own creation and a plan of his own making, and he was about to move forward with this were it not for our intervention at this point. In all of these FBI sting cases, it involves the informant or the undercover agent with the defendant almost from the beginning. And in most of these cases, the vast majority of these cases, it's the FBI providing the means and the opportunity. That really varies. Sometimes it's really quite egregious. There have been FBI sting operations involving, mentally incapacitated defendants and mentally ill defendants who are then provided with everything that they need. They don't have transportation, they don't have weapons, and they don't have money, and the FBI gives them everything. And in other cases, the capacity of the defendant is a little bit greater, but none, I haven't seen any cases where it's clear that this would have been a terrorist act were it not for the FBI's intervention. And it certainly seems in this case that, in the Michigan case, that this was an example where you had some people with some pretty bad ideas and perhaps violent ideas, and there are questions about whether they would have acted on it. But the FBI was so involved in encouraging them to such a degree that it seems, likely that this case wouldn't have happened or wouldn't have happened in the way it did or at the grand scale it did, right? Like kidnapping an American governor is quite a plot, right?
Right.
And would it have happened at that level were it not for, the FBI encouraging that?
Right, and just quickly before we run, we're only learning about this right now, the more and more details because of the reporting and because it's playing out in court. So having covered these cases for years, how do you think this case plays out for the defendants as it pertains to the entrapment allegations?
One of the things that seems to be working in the favor of the defendants in this particular case is that their attorneys are challenging the government's case in a way that's more vigorous than I've seen in other cases. And so, it's hard to say how this will, play out. If you look at the record of conviction in previous cases like this, the odds of an acquittal or the government dropping charges are probably low. But again, this is a little bit different in that you have so many informants involved. It is a right-wing case rather than an Islamist extremism case. And so, it's really hard to know. I think, I also think this is getting a lot more attention than a lot of the other types of sting cases we've seen. For obvious reasons, given that it involved a plot to kidnap a governor of a state. And so I think, for all those reasons, this kind of becomes, much more of a wild card than we've seen in other FBI sting cases.
Right, and a final point that I'd make is that we know that copycat criminals exist.
Yeah.
And so you might look at this and say, well, you know what? It's a little unfair that these folks are entrapped, whether they're right-wingers, whether they're right-wing Islamist extremists. But they were bad people anyway, and it's probably better to get them off the street. But that comes not just at a cost to due process and everything else that we believe in, but it also then creates in the public's mind the idea that these are actually prevalent things.
100%.
And then people who otherwise might not have thought about it are like, oh, well, if there are all these other people who are willing to put their lives on the line for whatever cause they believe in, well, then maybe I ought to do it too.
Well, and it also fuels the narrative that the government needs to take all of these this power grab and this war on domestic extremism and then create
more
this
Patriot Acts.
Yeah, we need a bigger and more robust domestic surveillance state, and it just fuels exactly what they want to do in that regard. Thank you so much for your time and for your help sort of giving us insight into all of these cases that have come in the past and how it relates to this one now.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We will have more Rising for you after this.